Hello there, friend. Where are you tonight? Curled beneath a blanket, listening to the hush between heartbeats. Has the last light faded, let the dark slip in like a slow breath, the room folding into stillness. Before sleep finds you, soft and silent, let me tell you a story. Not a fairy tale, not a myth, but something real. A story written in footprints and ashes. A story about us. From a time before memory had words. Leave a whisper in the comments, if you're still awake. Now, gently close your eyes. Let the walls of your room dissolve. Let the hum of machines fall away. Just you, the fire, the forest, and the story that waits in the dark. The unremarkable beginning. No one threw a party when Homo sapiens arrived. There was no mystical sky-cracking thunderclap. No comet signaling destiny. No whispered prophecy etched into the bark of some prehistoric tree. Just a baby born somewhere in East Africa, about 250,000 years ago, probably screaming, probably hungry, and probably confused. That baby had the same basic skull shape as you, the same feet, the same oddly pathetic body hair situation, and the same brain, give or take a few gigabytes. The early Homo sapiens didn't know they were special. They didn't even know they were Homo sapiens. They were just another upright ape trying not to be eaten, trying to find enough food, trying to stay warm at night while avoiding spiders the size of regrets. They didn't build pyramids. They didn't write poems. They didn't invent artisanal sourdough. They just existed, and honestly, that was hard enough. If you'd met them back then, you might not have been impressed. They walked a bit hunched. They grunted more than they spoke. They smelled like survival and smoke. But behind their eyes, something was flickering. An engine warming up. A spark not yet aflame. It just hadn't revved up yet. You'd probably think, well, at least they don't have Twitter, and move on. At the time, East Africa was teeming with life. Grazing herds wandered the grasslands, big cats skulked in the shadows, and a bunch of other hominins, not quite human, not quite gone, shared the landscape. Homo erectus, for one, was still roaming around with its long legs and smaller brain, doing just fine in its own lane. Then there were Neanderthals and Denisovans up north, probably muttering, "What is it with these skinny-legged weirdos showing up everywhere?" You see, Homo sapiens weren't alone. They were part of an awkward extended family, dozens of species in the Homo genus, who all, at some point, thought they had a shot at stardom. But for now, our species was just one thread in the tangle. They weren't dominant. They weren't even very numerous. If aliens had dropped in for a census, they might have marked us as meh, background characters. But they had one quiet advantage: adaptability. That big, energy-hungry brain came with a package deal: curiosity, playfulness, memory, and just enough anxiety to survive. And with those gangly limbs and upright posture, they could walk, and walk, and walk. They weren't the strongest, they weren't the fastest, but they were, annoyingly, persistent. Like that person at a party who just won't leave, early sapiens had a knack for sticking around. Of course, life was still brutally simple. Most of their time was spent not dying. Food wasn't in supermarkets, it was in bushes, running away, or sometimes trying to kill you first. Nights weren't lit by electricity, but by moonlight and fire, and only if you'd been lucky or clever enough to keep that fire going. Speaking of fire, that was one of their few flexes. Controlled fire had been around for a while by then. Thanks, Homo erectus. But Homo sapiens took the idea and made it personal. Fire wasn't just a survival tool anymore. It became a gathering place, a heartbeat in the dark. Around flames, they huddled together for warmth, shared cooked meat, and passed along whatever scraps of language and memory they had. And language, if we can even call it that, was probably more like an interpretive dance mated with a game of charades. They didn't have the full range of syntax or vocabulary, but they had rhythm, gestures, repetition, and something approximating empathy. Imagine trying to tell someone not to eat that mushroom while only using grunts and eyebrow acrobatics. That was daily life. Still, something in them watched. They watched how birds flew, how shadows shifted, how antelope moved. They didn't just react to the world, they started to notice it. They had no written records, no TikTok recaps, no yearbooks, but their bodies carried knowledge in the way they crouched before a hunt, the way they traced familiar trails, the way they taught their children without words. Knowledge moved from hands to eyes to hands again, in one long, unbroken chain of mimicry and meaning. But even then, you wouldn't call it a story yet. More like murmurs in the dust. A prelude. Every once in a while they made something odd. A carved piece of ochre, a bead, a flint tool that was slightly more elegant than it needed to be. These were breadcrumbs, signs, not of progress, but of possibility. They didn't mean anything huge at the time, just a little whisper from the future saying, "Hey, you might be capable of more." The world didn't tremble, the giraffes didn't applaud, but something was slowly coiling in the long muscles of history, something waiting. For now, Homo sapiens wandered East Africa, content or perhaps resigned to be another face in the crowd. No prophecies, no plans. Just the great grinding churn of day after day. They didn't know it yet, but they were rehearsing, stretching, getting ready to exit stage savannah. And the stage? Oh, it was about to get bigger. Wanderlust and the soggy feet. Somewhere along the way, Homo sapiens got itchy feet. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was hunger. Maybe someone just kept saying, "Hey, what's over that hill?" until the rest of the clan gave in to shut them up. Whatever the reason, around 100,000 years ago, small groups began leaving the warm, familiar cradles of Africa and wandering outward. Not in a grand exodus kind of way, more like a slow, reluctant shuffle with bad sandals and zero maps. These early migrants didn't know they were leaving Africa. To them, there were no continents, no borders, no idea of home as a place on a globe. There was just terrain, wet terrain, hot terrain, dangerous terrain, and occasionally very, very cold terrain. The first major wave probably hugged the coasts, which makes sense. You've got water, fish, predictable paths, and fewer saber-toothed surprises. As they trudged eastward, their feet squelched through muddy estuaries, toes numb from crossing rivers and swamps, gnawed by bugs who clearly thought Homo sapiens tasted like gourmet sashimi. They moved slowly, like generations slowly. A group might settle somewhere for decades, maybe centuries, before another nudge climate change, conflict, or the age-old "we're out of snacks" pushed them onward. They went up into the Middle East, down into India, through Southeast Asia, and eventually some made the incredible leap across ancient sea channels to reach Australia. Yes, Australia. By at least 65,000 years ago, barefoot humans had made it to the land of kangaroos, and everything tries to kill you. With no boats in the modern sense, they somehow crossed treacherous waters, possibly using rafts made of logs, reeds, or sheer optimism. Imagine arriving on the Australian continent for the first time. Oh look, a giant hopping deer with claws. Followed shortly by, wait, why is that duck laying eggs and poisoning me? To the north, they reached China and Siberia. To the west, Europe awaited, but it wasn't empty. That's when things got interesting. Europe wasn't just snow and rocks. It was the home turf of Neanderthals, thick-boned, big-nosed, stocky relatives who'd been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. And no, it wasn't an instant turf war. Homo sapiens didn't bust down the door like bouncers at a Neolithic nightclub. Instead, it was awkward cohabitation. Hey, nice cave you've got there, mind if we borrow a corner? The two species overlapped for thousands of years. They hunted similar animals. They dealt with the same ice and cold and endless mammoth-related logistics. And while they probably competed at times, evidence suggests they also mingled, like biologically. As in, some of your DNA, yes. Yours probably comes from a Neanderthal hookup under a mammoth hide. It wasn't just Neanderthals either. In Central and Southeast Asia, Homo sapiens bumped into Denisovans, another hominin group, less well known but genetically cozy with us. Traces of them remain in people today, especially those from Oceania and Southeast Asia. So yeah, early Homo sapiens were kind of like your messy cousin who doesn't ask before using your toothbrush. They didn't just visit, they left souvenirs. And through all this, they adapted. Skin color changed with latitude and UV exposure. Body shape adjusted for climate. Longer limbs for heat. Squatter frames for cold. Cultural quirks emerged. Some groups specialized in fishing, others in hunting reindeer or carving bone tools. Some painted on cave walls, others didn't. Evolution wasn't a ladder. It was a slow, soggy sprawl of trial and error, mostly error. And speaking of soggy ice was a big deal. The planet was in the middle of a dramatic glacial period, which meant massive ice sheets squatted across Europe and North America like badly placed furniture. Sea levels were lower. Much of the world looked like it had been left in the freezer too long. But lower seas meant land bridges. Humans could walk to places now underwater. They crossed into Japan, down through what's now Indonesia, and eventually into the grassy, mammoth-filled plains of Siberia. These weren't dry, cozy strolls. Think wind so cold it felt like knives. Think weeks of walking without seeing a single berry. Think, are we sure this isn't just a very long mammoth graveyard? And yet, they kept going. They weren't conquering. They weren't on a mission. They were just following where food and shelter led, curious, hungry, and too stubborn to stay put. Over tens of thousands of years, small bands moved like slow ripples across the earth, leaving behind traces. A footprint in ancient ash, a child's tooth in a Siberian cave, a tool dropped near a glacier, little ghosts in the ground, saying, "We were here." And then, quietly, Homo sapiens became global. Not everywhere yet, there were still vast frontiers untouched. But they had reached the outer edges of the known, to them, world. The population was still small, maybe a few million scattered across the planet at most. But something in that wandering had reshaped them. The more environments they adapted to, the more knowledge they acquired. And the more they bumped into other humans or hominins, the more they diversified. But they didn't know any of this. They didn't know they were building toward anything. No one had drawn a map with arrows and timelines. There was no narrator, just mud, wind, and the instinct to keep walking. A few things had improved. Stone tools became more refined. Fire-making got faster. There were even bone needles now sewing animal hides into coats that didn't immediately fall apart. But still no writing. Still no towns. Still no Instagram sunsets. They'd left Africa behind, but carried it with them in their bodies, their memories, their sense of rhythm, their dreams. Every fire they lit in a new land echoed the ones their ancestors huddled around back home. And even though their feet were now damp and blistered from crossing marshes or fording glacial rivers, their eyes still scanned the horizon with that same question. What's over there? Because the world was still wide open. Still wild. Still waiting. And Homo sapiens? They were just getting started. Cousins, not villains. By the time Homo sapiens reached Europe in earnest, say, around 45,000 years ago, the place was already leased. Not by bears or dragons, though both made appearances in local cave graffiti, but by our famous evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals. Now, if your only exposure to Neanderthals was through bad sitcom jokes or old museum dioramas with hunched-over brutes dragging clubs, we need to clear that up. Neanderthals were not dumb, knuckle-dragging villains waiting to be outclassed. They were humans. A different kind, sure, but strikingly similar. Think cousins at a family reunion, slightly awkward, great bone structure, and very into spears. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had been mastering the European landscape. They knew the terrain, the seasons, the animals. They weren't nomads in the same way as Homo sapiens. Their home was the oak forests, the limestone caves, the snow-packed valleys. And when sapiens arrived with their long limbs and foreign tools, Neanderthals probably stared and thought, who invited these guys? But this wasn't a Marvel showdown. There was no dramatic war between species. No single moment when Neanderthals were wiped out by the superior Homo sapiens with their magical wrist rockets. Instead, what we see in the archaeological record is long-term coexistence, tens of thousands of years of overlap. That's right. They shared the continent, sometimes caves, sometimes tools, and, occasionally, beds. Yes, we mingled. There was interbreeding, maybe not candlelit dinners and poetry, but enough gene flow that most non-African humans alive today carry somewhere between 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. That little stretch of code that makes your skin more tolerant to cold, possibly a Neanderthal gift. That odd immune response you inherited. Thanks, Auntie Neand. It wasn't just Neanderthals. Elsewhere, sapiens encountered Denisovans, a mysterious cousin known mostly through DNA and a pinky bone in a Siberian cave. While we know frustratingly little about them, seriously, one finger and a tooth, what we do know is that they also contributed to the human gene pool, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. So if your ancestors are from that region, you may have some Denisovan sparkle in you too. So what happened to these cousins? Did Homo sapiens gently outlast them, or not so gently nudge them off the evolutionary stage? The truth is, we don't know. But it probably wasn't one single cause. Climate change was hammering the northern hemisphere. Ice ages rolled in like bad roommates, making food scarce and winters cruel. Neanderthal populations were already small and scattered, maybe too scattered. Add to that a species like Homo sapiens showing up with new strategies, broader social networks, possibly more efficient communication, and yes, some weird bone flutes, and the competition got tight. But the idea that Homo sapiens wiped out Neanderthals with brute superiority, that's a little self-flattering. In reality, we might have overwhelmed them with sheer persistence. We outlasted them demographically, not militarily. Think less sword fight at dawn and more room slowly gets more crowded with Homo sapiens until Neanderthals quietly disappear into the historical wallpaper. And here's the kicker. We absorbed them. Not in some sci-fi Borg assimilation sense, but genetically, culturally, perhaps even emotionally. Maybe their stories lived on in ours. Maybe their songs merged with ours around firelight. Maybe their children became our children. So next time you see someone referring to a rude person as a Neanderthal, you can gently whisper, "You know that means you too, right?" Because this wasn't just a chapter about conflict. It was a slow interweaving of stories of fur-lined cloaks, shared firewood, borrowed tools, and long winters where survival didn't care what kind of skull you had. It cared if you had food, if you had warmth, if you had someone to huddle next to. And that, really, was the secret weapon of Homo sapiens. Connection. Our ancestors began to form larger social networks bands that linked with other bands, exchanging goods, information, maybe even marriage partners. While Neanderthal groups were often small and isolated, sapiens built a kind of social glue that allowed knowledge to travel. You figure out how to trap a rabbit in the east, and that trick finds its way to the west within a few generations. And then there was art. Neanderthals may have dabbled some ochre, a few carvings, but Homo sapiens went full theatre kid. Cave paintings exploded across Europe. Horses running, bison leaping, handprints like ancient signatures frozen in time. These weren't just doodles, they were declarations. We see the world, we feel something, and we want to share it. There's something deeply human about that urge to mark your presence on stone, to echo your voice through time. It wasn't useful, it wasn't food or fire, but it was meaning. And maybe that's the quiet, invisible line that separated us from our cousins. Not intelligence, not strength, not superiority, but the relentless desire to express ourselves, to connect across distance and time, to turn survival into story. The Neanderthals faded, but they didn't vanish entirely. Pieces of them live in our blood, our bones, our odd resistance to certain flu strains. They weren't villains. They were us, just a different version. And like any good family, we argued, collaborated, swapped ideas, and eventually blended. So next time you stare into a fire and feel something ancient stir in your chest, that might be a Neanderthal memory, flickering through the warmth. Fire, flesh, and family. It always began with fire, not the accidental kind that scorches dry grass and sends panicked hominins flailing into the bushes. No, this was the good kind, the kind that flickers with purpose, the kind that takes effort to start, patience to maintain, and discipline to protect from wind, rain, and that one kid in the clan who can't stop poking things. Fire had been tamed long before Homo sapiens showed up in their final form. Thank you, Homo erectus. But sapiens made it personal. Fire became more than a tool. It became a ritual, a center, a stage. Around it, everything began to happen. Food. For one, fire turned meat from stringy chewing contest to smoky delight. It softened tubers, killed parasites, and unlocked calories. Suddenly, survival didn't mean raw gristle, it meant roasted marrow, sizzling fat, the smell of something warm and done. Fire gave time to chew slowly, to rest your sore feet, to digest while looking at the stars and wondering if that one blinking light was angry. It was also a teacher. Around the fire, children watched. They watched hands scrape hides, crush pigments, sharpen bone. They listened not just to words, still limited, mostly grunts and expressive eyebrows, but to rhythms, gestures, tone. They learned through mimicry and proximity. Knowledge wasn't stored in scrolls, it lived in shoulders, in the way a hunter squinted at tracks, or a mother wrapped a baby just so. And fire gave birth to stories. Not polished bedtime tales with morals and plot twists, more like fragments, impressions, dramatic reenactments of that time. Someone almost got trampled by a woolly rhino. But these proto-stories carried meaning. They stitched the past to the present, explained the weather, or at least made it funnier. Around firelight, people weren't just surviving, they were starting to belong. That's when families got interesting. Family, for Homo sapiens, wasn't just blood, it was bonds. You might travel with your siblings, sure, but also with the couple who saved your life during a lion scare, or the quiet old man who remembered where the berries grew best. Clans were flexible. They bent around the needs of the group. New members were adopted. Elders were respected not because of age alone, but because they had seen things. They had stories in their bones. And let's not ignore the drama, because prehistoric humans, while lacking TikTok, were absolutely capable of interpersonal chaos. Food got stolen, jealousy flared, someone fell in love with someone else's mate. Occasionally, someone wandered off in a huff after being accused of hoarding roasted squirrel. In short, people. But instead of formal laws or judges, things were settled through gestures, silent apologies, shared meat. You handed someone the choicest cut of antelope after a fight, and that was the prehistoric equivalent of, "I'm sorry I said you smell like a dead lizard." Community meant cooperation. You annoyed each other, forgave each other, and huddled together when the snow came. And the snow did come. The Ice Age was not subtle. Cold snapped across the globe, pressing humanity into tighter groups, closer fires, thicker furs. It was a time of ingenuity. Layered clothing from stitched hides, shelters built into caves or dug into hillsides, and cooperative hunts that made even mammoths nervous. In some places, reindeer became the staple. In others, seals. And always, the fire kept burning. Not just for warmth, but for identity. People began painting themselves with ochre, decorating tools with tiny carvings, shaping necklaces from animal teeth or shells carried hundreds of miles. These weren't just accessories, they were signs, clues, a growing need to say, "This is who we are." Language, too, was changing. Still not fully modern, still more than Shakespeare, but the building blocks were falling into place. Clicks, whistles, tones, a gesture combined with a sound. Then a sound meant something. Then a sound could stand in for a thing not even there. A mammoth, the sun, that weird dream you had where the elk had two heads. The leap from symbol to idea was slow, but seismic. And in this wordless but not voiceless world, bonds tightened, parenting was shared. Childcare wasn't outsourced to experts with certifications, it was the entire group's job. A child might be passed from arm to arm, breastfed by one woman, taught by another, disciplined by a third. Homo sapiens didn't raise lone wolves, they raised wolf packs, because survival was too hard to go it alone. Remember, there were still predators, still cliffs to fall off, fevers to sweat through, rival groups with very pointy sticks. Trust wasn't optional, it was woven into daily life. You knew who would help pull you from the mud. You knew who could fix your spear. You knew who would still share their food, even if you were kind of annoying. These early humans were not living in Eden. Life was not easy, or noble, or simple. They felt fear, anger, grief. They watched loved ones die from infections we now cure with a trip to the pharmacy. They buried children. They fought. They wept. They sat long hours in silence. But amid all that, they laughed. Yes, really. Laughter spontaneous, contagious, healing. It might have started with play among children or relief after escaping a close call. But the human capacity for humour was already there. The ability to laugh in the cold, to point at someone's unfortunate tumble and collapse into shared giggles. That was sacred too. And when night came, when the stars stretched out like ancient pinholes in the black velvet of the sky, Homo sapiens didn't just sleep. They dreamed. Not just literal dreams, but the first hints of imagination. What if we hunted together instead of alone? What if we painted the walls of this cave to remember that time the bison charged? What if we believed the fire could protect us from spirits? The mind was starting to wake up in ways it never had before. Slowly, cautiously, but undeniably, because something was stirring behind the eyes of Homo sapiens. A question, a flicker, not just how do we live, but why? What really happened at 50,000? And then boom. Okay, not an explosion you'd hear with your ears, more like a silent brain fire, a cognitive fuse quietly sparking to life around 50,000 years ago. Almost overnight, in evolutionary terms, Homo sapiens stopped just surviving and started behaving weirdly well. Archaeologists call it the Great Leap Forward, which sounds like a marketing campaign for caveman yoga mats. But behind the buzzword is a real, stunning shift. Tools got fancier, art got bolder, burials got emotional, music appeared, trade networks stretched hundreds of miles. Suddenly, we were decorating everything from bones to bodies to cave walls with an energy that screamed, "We finally get it." Oh, so what changed? Some scientists say it was a biological mutation, a new neural pathway flicking on like a forgotten light switch in the back of the brain. Others argue it wasn't a single moment, but a slow stacking of knowledge finally tipping over into culture. A few say it was social density, more people living together, exchanging ideas, gossiping about whose flint knives were the sharpest. Honestly, no one knows, but the evidence is clear. Something happened, and it happened everywhere Homo sapiens went. Around 50,000 years ago, cave art explodes across France, Spain, Indonesia. People start carving little figurines out of ivory and stone fat fertility goddesses, hybrid animal-human creatures, and other items that may or may not have been prehistoric action figures. You know, for the kids, tools become specialized. A blade isn't just a blade, it's a microlith, carefully chipped, symmetrical, maybe even kind of pretty. Spears are tipped with fine points. Needles are honed from bone, thread made from sinew. Sewing becomes possible, and fashion is born mostly fur, mostly beige. But hey, it's a look. There are pendants now, shells with holes drilled in them, animal teeth strung on sinew cords. Not for function, for flair, for meaning. We weren't just eating the world anymore, we were interpreting it. Language, too, may have crossed a threshold. While earlier forms existed in gesture and tone, now things got layered. You could describe something not here, you could refer to last week, or warn someone about a snake you saw 3 valleys over, or explain how to carve a perfect arrowhead using only words and dramatic hand flailing. This is when teaching levels up. Instead of learning by imitation alone, knowledge could be told, passed on in narrative, in instruction, in song. Suddenly, one good idea could spread like wildfire, and unlike actual wildfire, you didn't have to run from it. You could share it, adapt it, remix it. Culture had become portable, and where there's culture, there's identity. Groups began to differentiate more clearly, not just in what they ate or how they hunted, but in what they believed. We see the rise of ritual objects, sacred sites, and yes, deliberate burial practices. Graves with grave goods tools, jewelry, even red ochre to stain the body. These weren't just corpses tossed into holes. These were people, remembered, which means someone was asking, what happens after? Let's pause here. This doesn't mean prehistoric humans suddenly turned into Zen philosophers. They still argued over food, still grunted in frustration, still stepped on thorns and cursed the ground. But the context was shifting. Behind their eyes was a new kind of awareness. Of self, of others, of time, of death. The world wasn't just full of things, it was full of symbols. Like the flute. Yes, a flute. Made of vulture bone. Found in Germany. Dated to around 40,000 years ago. Which means somewhere, long before Beethoven, someone sat in a cave and thought, I should hollow out this bone and blow into it to make a sound that no predator will ever appreciate. That's not survival. That's art. Or consider the cave paintings of Chauvet or Lascaux. Horses with motion implied by the curves of rock. Bulls drawn 10 feet wide. Hands stenciled like signatures across time. These weren't just doodles. They were communication across generations. They said, I was here. I saw this. It mattered. And then there's the Lion Man, a figurine carved from mammoth ivory, standing over a foot-tall, half-human, half-lion. It's not a tool. It's not a snack. It's an idea. A myth. That means someone, somewhere, was imagining beings that didn't exist, which means imagination was now a survival trait. This was the true revolution, the human mind unlocking itself. And once that door opened, it never shut. Because ideas don't sit still, they breed. One symbolic gesture leads to another. One painted bison leads to 20. One flute leads to rhythm. Rhythm leads to music. And music leads to dance. And dance leads to people stomping around fires at night, shouting things they don't fully understand but feel. That's culture. That's us. So when you hear 50,000 years ago, don't picture a caveman clubbing his way to greatness. Picture someone stringing a bead necklace for their child. Picture a mother painting a handprint on a cave wall, whispering to herself. Picture a group sitting by firelight, passing around a carved lion man figure, telling stories about its power. That's what changed. We became meaning makers. Not better, not more moral, just aware of life, of time, of each other. And in a world still full of predators and hunger and freezing nights, that awareness was both a blessing and a burden, but it meant we were no longer just a species. We were a storytelling species. And that changed everything. The great forgetting. The funny thing about human memory is it's terrible. Oh sure, your brain can recall the exact lyrics to a song you haven't heard in 20 years, or the time you said something awkward in 7th grade. But as a species, we forget almost everything. Whole cultures, entire languages, stories passed down for generations, gone, vanished like footprints in a flood. This wasn't planned. Homo sapiens didn't wake up one day, stretch their shoulders and say, let's forget 80% of everything we ever knew and see what happens. It just happened. Slowly. Tragically. And maybe sometimes, necessarily. Here's how it worked. Back in those rich, symbolic days after 50,000 BCE, humans were everywhere. Europe, Asia, Australia, parts of the Pacific. Different groups flourished in their own ways. Some painted, others carved, some danced around ancestor poles, others perfected stone tools with eerie precision. They built up knowledge, rituals, and oral traditions layered like geological strata. But they didn't write any of it down. Writing wouldn't show up for tens of thousands of years. And without it, culture was trapped in mouths and memories. If your grandmother forgot the words to the moon song, or your uncle died before teaching you how to carve the sacred spiral, that was it. The knowledge was gone. No backup drive. No cloud. Just poof. This was the first great forgetting. Every time a clan wandered off, split from the main group, or was wiped out by disease, famine, or a saber-toothed miscalculation, the stories scattered. Songs faded. Symbol systems crumbled. Whole lineages of wisdom, herbal medicine, animal behavior, constellations, were erased by time and weather. But the forgetting wasn't just loss. Sometimes it was change. As Homo sapiens migrated, they adapted to new environments. And adaptation meant letting go of some things to make room for others. The fishing techniques that worked in the tropics? Useless in the Arctic tundra. The rituals tied to a mountain you'd left behind? Beautiful, but irrelevant on the savannah. And so, piece by piece, the ancient human library was rewritten. Imagine a culture moving through time like a long braid. One strand represents knowledge, another, myth, another, memory. But if a hand drops part of the braid, it unravels. What you end up with is a frayed, reinvented version of the original, close enough to be familiar, but far enough that no one remembers where it started. Even more frustrating? Evidence suggests that humans built amazing things long before agriculture. There are sites Göbekli Tepe, for example, that suggest elaborate stonework and spiritual centers existed before formal farming societies, which raises the question, how many other things did we forget before we started writing things down? Maybe early humans invented calendars based on the moon. Maybe they had stories about the stars that rival our myths. Maybe there were healing dances, sacred geometries, seasonal songs that made sense of chaos. But because they weren't etched in anything permanent, they vanished. And still, we moved. The migrations continued. Into Siberia, across ice bridges into the Americas, down into the fertile river valleys of what would one day become Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China. Each group carrying a sack of memories, some precious, some half-remembered, some misunderstood, and turned into something else. And that's where things got beautifully messy. A hunter in the Andes might remember the old story about a sky serpent, but now it's tied to mountain storms instead of river floods. A carver in Papua may chisel a spiral because his great-grandmother taught him, though no one remembers what it means. A mother in Borneo paints her baby's face with red clay because that's what you do, though the original reason was lost 6 migrations ago. Tradition without memory becomes ritual, and ritual without meaning? Well, sometimes it becomes magic, or nonsense, or both. But it didn't matter, because humans are meaning-making machines. When the old meanings faded, they made new ones. When one story died, they whispered another into its place. Like moss growing over a forgotten carving, culture kept going even if the carving underneath was never seen again. Sometimes, the forgetting even helped us evolve. Let's be honest, not all ancestral knowledge was gold. Maybe someone figured out how to cure a fever by feeding the patient fermented raccoon brains and making them sleep inside a deer carcass. If that one got lost in the shuffle, probably for the best. But there's something a little sad, isn't there? Knowing we were once surrounded by voices, millions of them, and now we only hear echoes. Knowing we once had a map of our own humanity, sketched in songs and dances and soot, and most of it blew away like dry leaves. And yet, the fire remained. The fire always remained. Even when the stories faded, the flame stayed lit. The instinct to gather, to tell, to share. You can forget the words to a song, but still remember the tune. You can forget the name of your ancestor, but still feel her hand when you shape the clay. Culture lives in the body. Memory hides in the fingertips. And sometimes, forgetting clears space, because the next chapter, the one coming soon, required room. Room for farming, for cities, for gods and governments and bureaucrats with opinions on irrigation schedules. All of that was on the horizon. But here, in the quiet before civilization, Homo sapiens stood halfway between myth and method, with one foot in the dream world and the other in the real. They had travelled across continents, painted caves, tamed fire, buried their dead, and forgotten more than we will ever know. The party at the edge of ice. By the time the last ice age was really flexing its frosty muscles, Homo sapiens were huddling closer, sharpening spears, and developing a flair for dramatic outfits involving fur, feathers, and probably the occasional bit of mammoth snot. Europe, in particular, had become a frozen canvas. Towering glaciers swept across the land like rude house guests rearranging the furniture. Entire valleys were buried under miles of ice. Rivers froze, solid. Forests creaked under snow they didn't sign up for. It was quite frankly a terrible time to be poorly dressed. But here's the twist. This is when human creativity exploded. Let's be clear, the Ice Age wasn't cozy. People lost fingers. Frostbite was practically a birthright. You could fall asleep and not wake up. But where most creatures huddled, hid, or died, Homo sapiens adapted. Or more accurately, they threw a party. Not a literal party, of course. No cake, no glitter. But in cultural terms, a roaring bash. This was the era of reindeer hunters, mammoth chasers, and the first people to look at a snowy cliff and think, you know what would look great here? A cave lion in ochre. The caves of Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, these were not casual doodles. These were Sistine chapels of the Paleolithic. Paintings that captured motion, emotion, maybe even magic. Horses mid-gallop, bison in full snort, animals stacked like dreams across the stone. And those hand stencils, again dozens of them, pressed onto cave walls as if to say, we were here, we mattered, and we knew beauty when we saw it. What's wild is how good the art is. These weren't amateurs. These were people who observed animal movement with such care. They could draw it in the dark using only flickering firelight and crushed minerals. Some even used the shape of the cave walls to create a 3D effect. That's right, Paleolithic pop art. But it wasn't just art. It was culture. They developed tailored clothing, not just wrap yourself in a dead bear fashion, but sewn garments using bone needles, layers, belts, decorative tassels, possibly for status or just because humans love flair. There are even hints of tattoos, though unfortunately no ancient Instagram selfies survive to confirm. These Ice Age communities also created elaborate rituals. Burial sites from this period show bodies carefully placed with grave goods, beads, tools, ochre, sometimes even entire animal skulls. This wasn't just toss grandma in a hole. It was ceremony. It was memory. Maybe even early religion. And the magic? Oh yes. Reindeer bones carved with strange markings. Antlers arranged in symbolic shapes. Caves where people didn't live but visited. Maybe for vision quests, rites of passage, or just to feel something beyond the cold. This was the rise of the shaman age, the first spiritual leaders perhaps, people who danced in animal skins, mimicked deer calls, or entered trance states to speak to ancestors or invisible forces. Some may have used mushrooms or herbs to make the veil between worlds a little thinner, because when survival feels impossible, you don't just need shelter, you need meaning. Let's not forget music. Flutes made of vulture bone and mammoth ivory weren't rare, they were spreading. And with flutes came rhythm, and with rhythm came drums. Okay, no surviving drums from this time, but you can bet someone was banging on a hollow log or clacking bones together like prehistoric castanets. Humans can't not dance. We will make music out of rocks if we have to. It's in our DNA. So picture this. A snowstorm rages outside. Inside a cave, firelight dances on the walls. A group of humans huddles together, wrapped in stitched hides. One of them plays a flute. Another taps a bone rhythm on a rock. A third paints a reindeer mid-leap, while a fourth tells a story about a spirit who lives in the northern wind. No government, no buildings, no written language, and yet civilization, in its rawest, realist form. Because civilization isn't cities or currency. It's shared symbols, it's rituals. It's someone looking you in the eye and saying, you are part of this, you belong here. The Ice Age demanded closeness. It punished isolation. And so, humans learned to build not just huts but communities. You couldn't survive solo. You needed hunters, cooks, artists, listeners, healers. Everyone had a role, and the more interconnected you were, the better your odds of making it through another winter. And there were plenty of winters. This cold stretch lasted for tens of thousands of years. Entire generations were born and died without ever seeing a summer without snow. But through all that cold came cohesion, because suffering, when shared, becomes story, and story becomes glue. Somehow, Through all this, humans even started looking outward again. They ventured across frozen land bridges into the British Isles, into Japan, into Siberia. Some crossed into the Americas, possibly following herds across Beringia, that stretch of land, now underwater, that once connected Russia to Alaska. That migration would become its own saga, but that's a tale for another part. For now, just know this. Humans did not just endure the Ice Age. They thrived in it. They made art, music, myths, and jokes. They dressed in style, danced in caves, raised families beside glaciers, and carved animals they both feared and revered. They took the world's harshest stage and turned it into a theatre. And when the ice finally began to melt, they didn't just emerge blinking into the sun. They emerged changed, because in the dark, cold grip of the Ice Age, they'd learned something fundamental. Even if the world is trying to kill you, you can still tell a good story by the fire. We made the megafauna nervous. Picture a mammoth. Huge, hairy, tusks long enough to open a can of beans on the moon, an absolute unit of an herbivore, lording over the tundra like it paid property tax. For a long time, mammoths and their Ice Age cousins ruled the land, not just mammoths, but woolly rhinos, giant sloths the size of small cars, armored glyptodons, saber-toothed cats with fangs that doubled as fashion statements, and beavers the size of bears. It was a megafaunal party. And then we showed up. Homo sapiens didn't come with a warning label. No trumpets, no meteor. Just quietly, methodically, we arrived in new places. And shortly after, the big animals started vanishing. Coincidence? Maybe. A little. Climate change was already rewriting the map. Ice was retreating, forests creeping in, grasslands shifting, water levels rising. All that certainly stressed the giant creatures of old. But let's be real. We weren't exactly innocent tourists. We were clever, coordinated, and hungry. And when you're hungry, and you see a 1,000-pound walking meat fridge covered in shaggy insulation, your brain says, yes, that one. Kill it. Oh, the thing is, we got really good at this. Hunting, yes, but also tracking, understanding animal migration patterns, studying habits, making traps. Some groups may have even driven entire herds off cliffs in coordinated stampedes, prehistoric logistics at its finest. And it wasn't just the Ice Age giants of Eurasia. When humans arrived in Australia, the 1,500-pound flightless Genyornis disappeared. Marsupial lions? Gone. Diprotodons think wombats the size of hippos? Toast. Same story in the Americas. Once we crossed that Bering land bridge and made it south, out went the mammoths, the saber-tooths, the giant ground sloths, the American lions. South America's weird camel-like beasts. Adios. And it wasn't just land dwellers. Coastal species too took a hit as our appetites spread. What's striking is the pattern. In places where Homo sapiens showed up last, like Australia and the Americas, the extinction events came swiftly. Like walking into a room where the lights go out as you enter, one by one. Creepy, no? So, was this evil? Were early humans nature's first villains? The original extinction machine? Not exactly. They didn't know. To them, a mammoth was just food and fur, an opportunity. And unlike modern industrial slaughter, their hunts were face-to-face, risky, personal. They didn't wipe out animals because they could. They just wanted dinner. And maybe a new coat. Still, the impact was massive. With megafauna gone, ecosystems reshaped. Predators vanished. Plants changed. The web of life trembled. It's possible humans also created niche environments, burning forests to flush animals, encouraging certain plants. We were already curating nature without realizing it. Farmers in the making, while still technically full-time hunters. Some groups even started domesticating animals not in the pen and leash way, but in early partnerships. Dogs, in particular, may have begun shadowing human groups. Maybe they started as scavengers, then became alert systems, then companions. At some point, a human tossed a bone, and the proto-dog brought it back, and history said, yep, this is happening. But if dogs were getting cozy, other animals were getting scarce. The loss of megafauna hit hard. It meant diets changed. Some humans turned to smaller game, to fish, to foraged plants. Hunting styles adapted lighter tools, faster strategies, traps instead of brute force. We became more efficient, more focused. And culturally, the memory of the giants lingered. You can see it in cave art, massive beasts painted even after they'd vanished. In stories passed down through oral traditions, thunderbirds, sky bulls, talking mammoths. In rituals that may have once honored the spirits of now extinct prey, some researchers believe that the tales of giants and monsters from ancient myth are echoes of a time when we really did walk among them. So in a way, the megafauna didn't fully die. They lived on in dreams, in stories whispered at the edge of firelight, in the shapes carved onto antlers, in the bones kept like trophies. Still, something changed in us. The disappearance of the giants may have forced Homo sapiens to become more rooted, more careful. With the biggest prey gone, the days of feasting gave way to leaner times. People started managing resources more cautiously. They moved differently. Their relationship to the land shifted from conquest to stewardship, from abundance to balance, or at least attempts at balance. And slowly, in pockets of the world, the seeds of settlement began to take root. Places where animals returned seasonally, rivers with reliable fish, forests with predictable berries. You start to stay longer, build better shelters, keep track of time, observe the cycles. You remember where the roots grow fat, when the herds will pass, when the rains come. You're not farming yet, not really, but your mind is tilting that way. Because with fewer big animals, you need more strategy. You burn the underbrush to make gathering easier. You replant tubers closer to camp. You scatter seeds without meaning to. And next year, surprise, there's a patch of edible greens where you dropped your compost. Is it magic? Or just the beginning of agriculture? So no, the megafauna didn't vanish because we were evil, but their absence nudged us toward a different future. One with smaller animals, smaller hunts, and eventually smaller spaces to roam. Because when the world felt less wild, we started taming it. And whether we realized it or not, we were also taming ourselves. The garden before the garden. Long before the first wheat sprouted politely in a sun-drenched valley, Homo sapiens were already gardening. Not with rows of corn or tidy scarecrows, mind you. No one was putting on overalls or saying things like crop rotation. But still, humans had begun nudging nature. You could call it accidental agriculture, more like strategic wandering with a hint of botany. Because by the time we get to around 20,000 years ago, people weren't just foraging randomly anymore. They knew what to look for, what grew where, what ripened when, and how to make sure it came back next year. It started with fire. Controlled burns weren't new. We've seen signs of them as far back as Homo erectus, but sapiens took it to a new level. They'd set fire to forest underbrush to encourage the growth of plants they liked. Berries, tubers, small game-friendly clearings. Fire shaped the land, cleared paths, and discouraged bigger predators from hanging around the campfire because nothing kills the mood like a saber-tooth cameo. This was early land management. An entire ecosystem redesigned using a tool as ancient as fear itself. Some indigenous communities still use these methods today, so if you're imagining prehistoric chaos, replace that with careful, generational knowledge passed down in footpaths and muscle memory. And it wasn't just plants. People noticed that some animals hung around camp. Certain birds didn't fly away. Some pigs liked our garbage. Wolves started trailing hunting parties not to fight, but to scavenge. And over generations those wolves changed. They stopped snarling quite so much. Their ears shifted. Their coats softened. And eventually, one of them wagged its tail and flopped on its side. And someone said, "Okay, that's staying." That was the beginning of domestication. Not through force, but relationship. Co-evolution. We changed them. They changed us. Dogs became hunting partners, early warning systems, foot warmers, even spiritual companions. And in return, we gave them leftovers and eternal emotional baggage. Humans also started weeding their world. Not pulling dandelions out of the lawn, that's a modern anxiety, but choosing certain plants over others. You find a grove of nut-bearing trees, you protect it. You notice a tasty root grows better when you scatter some of its bits in loose soil? You start doing that on purpose. Slowly, subtly, you're shaping the land. Seeds stuck to clothes. Spoiled food got tossed. And the next season, boom plants sprouted closer to camp. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was divine intervention. Or maybe it was just a bunch of clever apes learning that cause and effect isn't just for tool making, it works on life. In some places, people began returning to the same sites year after year. Rivers rich with fish, valleys with edible greens, plateaus perfect for seasonal gatherings. These weren't permanent homes, not yet, but they were starting to feel familiar, and with familiarity came culture. Now you had landmarks, trails, shared histories. That rock over there, where your grandfather saw the elk spirit, that grove, where the red berries grow sweet, that flat clearing, where we dance when the moon is full. You don't need fences to have territory. You just need memory. And when humans remember together, they start building stories. Some were practical. Don't eat that mushroom unless you enjoy screaming at trees. Others were moral. The ancestors live in the river, so don't poop in it. And others were pure cosmology. The stars are the campfires of sky. People who watch us dance. Suddenly, the natural world isn't just scenery. It's sacred. Meanwhile, toolkits were evolving. Grinding stones appeared, mortars and pestles, likely for crushing seeds, roots, or pigment. This means people weren't just chewing things straight off the vine anymore. They were processing, transforming, adding steps between plant and plate. Cooking had gone from survival to cuisine. Containers followed, baskets, gourds, early pottery, because once you have more food than you can eat immediately, you need to store it. And once you store it, you have the beginnings of surplus. And once you have surplus, you get to the dangerous question. What if we just stayed here? Not full-time, not yet, but the idea was forming. And in some places, like the Fertile Crescent, the Jordan Valley, or the highlands of New Guinea, humans started experimenting with real cultivation, sowing seeds, tending sprouts, watching with obsessive care as green shoots turned into grain. The world was becoming legible. That transition didn't happen all at once. It took thousands of years, and most humans resisted it for a while. Why give up roaming and variety for the monotony of dirt work and grain breath? But slowly, more people tried it. And when times got tough, drought, famine, overhunted game farming offered a seductive promise. Control. And human love control. The wild was beautiful, but terrifying. You never knew if the herds would come back, if the berries would bloom, if the winter would be kind. Farming whispered, "What if you made the rules?" It was an illusion, of course. Nature still had final say. Crops failed, diseases spread, but the temptation was strong. So here we were somewhere between wild and domestic, between wanderers and settlers, between myth and method. Still dancing, still hunting, still painting, but also planting, also planning, also wondering, maybe for the first time, what if we built something that lasted? We hadn't quite stepped into civilization, but we'd built the garden just outside the gate, and we were already reaching for the handle. The trap called farming. It probably started out as a good idea. Some clever humans somewhere around 10,000 years ago looked around and said, "Hey, what if instead of chasing food, we just made food stay put?" Grain seemed cooperative. Lentils didn't run away screaming. And goats? They were basically walking cheese machines. So we started planting, started herding, started settling. And at first it worked. Villages popped up along rivers. People built semi-permanent homes. Crops sprouted. Granaries filled. This is it, they thought. The future. And they were right, sort of. Farming would go on to shape everything we know about civilization. But also, it kind of ruined our vibe. See, the moment we began farming, we traded freedom for calories. No more long strolls across a grassy savanna, singing songs and following herds. Now we had seasons to track, fields to weed, pests to fight, and a whole lot of back pain. We didn't just plant crops, we planted obligation. The first farmers were shorter than their forager grandparents. Their bones were more brittle. Their teeth were riddled with decay. Turns out a diet of mostly grain is like giving your molars sandpaper and sugar at the same time. Diseases spread faster in settled communities. And if your harvest failed, you weren't chasing bison anymore, you were just hungry in the same sad house. But we pushed forward, because that's what humans do. Grain made population booms possible. More mouths meant more hands to plant more grain. More grain meant more babies. And so the spiral began. Agriculture fed people, who made more people, who needed more agriculture, who made more people. Congratulations, you're now trapped in the first great human feedback loop. And you couldn't just leave. Once a village formed, you had infrastructure, you had fences, you had fields with names, you had property, which meant you also had disputes. Hey, that goat's mine. No, that's my barley field. And just like that, conflict was born not over survival, but over stuff. This led to rules, and rules needed enforcers, maybe an elder, maybe a chief, eventually a king. Suddenly, we're not just farming food, we're farming hierarchies. Social roles became rigid. Someone had to plant, someone had to harvest, someone had to build storage huts, someone had to sit around and make sure no one stole the seeds. And guess who usually ended up doing the hardest, least respected jobs? Hint, it wasn't the guy sitting in the shade inventing taxation. Gender roles solidified too. In many early societies, women had been central to gathering, foraging, even medicine. But in the new agrarian order, power often flowed to whoever controlled land, and land often fell into male hands. Patriarchy didn't appear out of thin air. It sprouted right alongside the wheat. Meanwhile, we started measuring time. Seasons became sacred. Calendars were scratched into bones, marked on stones, chanted into memory. You had to know when to plant, when to reap, when to dig irrigation ditches so your barley wouldn't die a slow, crunchy death. That obsession with timing? That's where clocks eventually came from. That's right, your stressful Google Calendar has roots in someone watching the moon phases so their lentils didn't betray them. And then came the math. Not beautiful abstract math, but angry, practical math. How many goats do I owe you? How much barley fits in that pot? Whose turn is it to clean the grain pit? From that, chaos came counting systems. And from counting came writing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First came the granary. Because once you had surplus food, you needed a place to store it, which meant someone had to guard it, which meant someone got to own it, which meant someone else didn't. And from that dynamic hoarding, access, control came one of humanity's stickiest inventions, class. The people who grew the grain weren't the same people who measured it, stored it, or redistributed it. And those higher up the ladder? They started to believe the grain came from them, as if they had personally willed it into existence by sitting there looking important. And when you questioned it, they could say, "This is just the way things are. The God said so." Or worse, "It's for your own good." But here's the thing. We didn't notice the trap right away. The early farmers were probably just relieved they didn't have to chase anything with spears anymore. They had homes, hearths, warm stew. Babies were born and didn't have to freeze to death under the stars. That felt like progress. And in many ways it was. Farming brought stability. It allowed for more complex societies. It gave rise to technology, writing, trade, even wine. Shout out to fermented grapes for getting us through civilization. People lived longer, though not necessarily better. Life was predictable, but also, strangely, smaller. Gone were the wide-open migrations, the seasonal festivals under strange skies, the shared songs echoing across valleys. Now it was fields, fences, forms you had to fill out in triplicate and give to a man named who was very grumpy about the size of your goat tax. Okay, not literally, but spiritually, yes. We had taken the first steps towards cities, empires, organized religion, and governments. But those steps came with a cost. The freedom to move became the obligation to stay. The abundance of wild variety became the monotony of monoculture. The shared, flexible roles of tribal life became fixed hierarchies and labor divisions. And worst of all, we couldn't go back. Not really. The population was too high. The land too carved up. The social systems too entrenched. And so, with 1,000 plows and 10,000 debts, Homo sapiens walked willingly into the golden-lit cage of agriculture. It fed us. It bound us. It made us powerful. But it also made us tired. And the worst part? We thought we'd chosen it. Gods, kings and grains. With farming came food. With food came storage. With storage came ownership. And with ownership came the most inevitable thing of all, meetings. Someone had to decide who got what. Someone had to oversee the granary. Someone had to deal with disputes like, his goats keep pooping in my barley. And so, as humans started piling up wheat, they also started piling up power. Enter the kings. Okay, maybe they didn't call themselves kings at first. Maybe they were just the one with the big stick, or the loudest elder with the best ox. But before long, someone figured out that if you sit at the center of the food pile, you don't have to plant or harvest, you just have to supervise. And if you do it well enough, people will start thinking you were chosen by the sky. This was the birth of divine authority. The moment some guy said, "I didn't ask to be in charge, the gods picked me," and everyone else, exhausted from threshing grain in 110-degree heat, kind of shrugged and said, "Sure, fine, whatever. Just please make the rats go away." But of course, once you have kings and gods and food, you need records. And records require writing. No one invented writing to compose poetry or blog about their feelings. The first written words were about grain. Who owed what? How much barley went missing? Why Ur's goats are still a problem. Cuneiform, the earliest known writing system, was basically the world's first spreadsheet, carved into wet clay tablets that hardened in the sun and cursed archaeologists forever. From writing came bureaucracy, and from bureaucracy came civilization. Cities rose in places like Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and along the Yellow River. These weren't just big villages, they were systems. They had zoning, they had taxes, they had social classes and waterworks and priests and people who made their living painting tiny spirals on pots. Civilization was structure. It was reliable. It was also wildly inefficient, because while the elites bathed in imported oils and performed rituals to ensure the sun would rise, most people were bent over in fields, trying not to die of grain-induced back spasms. Still, the dream was appealing. Order, permanence, legacy. Cities allowed humans to specialize. You didn't have to grow food anymore if you made shoes, or tools, or amulets shaped like beetles. People began trading locally, then regionally, then across deserts and seas. Goods moved. Ideas moved. Diseases moved. People moved. Human life went from village shuffle to global cha-cha. Religion scaled up too. In tribal times, spirits lived in rivers, trees, or the occasional bear-shaped thundercloud. But now, with temples and taxes and armies, the gods had to step up their game. They became more organized, more demanding. Some had names like Enlil or Ra or Inanna. Some wanted offerings, songs, or a cow. Others wanted your eternal obedience and the occasional child sacrifice. The priests? Oh, they loved this. Suddenly, they were the only ones who could read the stars, interpret omens, or translate divine messages that conveniently supported the current leadership. Religion stopped being something you did and became something done to you. It was a full-time industry, with robes, incense, rules, and more side-eye than a camel caravan with only one water jug. And war? Don't get us started. Before cities, most violence was personal, a grudge, a theft, a really intense argument over a stolen bone tool. But now, with borders, taxes, and "this land is ours because my God says so," organized warfare became a thing. Armies formed, weapons improved, fortifications rose, and some very bored farmers became very reluctant soldiers. But not everything was doom and dirt. Civilizations produced incredible things. Bronze tools, irrigation systems, mathematics, early surgery, astronomy. They mapped the stars, charted eclipses, invented zero, eventually, and built structures that still make us gasp. The pyramids didn't stack themselves, and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia were basically ancient skyscrapers with better real estate views than most modern apartments. Art flourished. Music echoed in courtyards. Laws were written in stone, not metaphorically but literally. Hammurabi's code stood tall, shouting things like, "An eye for an eye," and "Don't mess with other people's donkeys." But at the heart of it all, grain. It was the currency, the power, the burden. Your life could rise or fall with the success of your harvest or your proximity to the storage vault. And in a delicious twist of irony, most of those early kings, they didn't build their thrones on gold, they built them on bread. Yet, as cities grew, something was lost. People became numbers. Identities faded into jobs. Villages where everyone knew your name became crowded quarters where no one knew your soul. The clan-based intimacy of the past turned into urban anonymity. You could now live in a crowd and still be alone. And the stories? They changed too. The playful tales of ancestors and spirits gave way to epics, grand, serious stories carved in stone. Gilgamesh, Isis, and Osiris. Myths of floods and kings and gods who were basically moody landlords with lightning bolts. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were structure. They told you who you were, what your place was, who you were not allowed to be. They also hinted at anxiety. Beneath the majesty and monuments, people were uneasy. Cities brought complexity, but also fragility. One bad harvest, one selfish ruler, one cracked irrigation canal, and everything unraveled. So humans clung to ritual, to law, to gods, to anything that made the chaos seem scripted. This was the trade we made. We left the forest for the field, then the field for the city. And in the city, we built shrines to stability, even when that stability rested on cracked foundations and exhausted shoulders, because we wanted meaning, safety, glory, and we were willing to kneel for it. The great sorting hat. Civilization is a sorting machine, not a gentle, encouraging sorting, more like a giant hand that grabs you by the tunic and says, "You go there. You stay here. You? You get to wear jewelry and drink goat milk out of gold. You? You get mud." Once Homo sapiens moved into cities, they didn't just stack bricks. They started stacking people. At the top, the elites. Kings, priests, landowners, folks who didn't till the soil but somehow owned it. They wore robes, talked to gods, or claimed to, and made rules. Often, they were one and the same. Divine right meant that if you questioned the guy with the shiny hat, you weren't just being rebellious, you were insulting the universe. Bad move. Then came the scribes, the artisans, the merchants, the middlers. Not quite divine, but literate. Trusted with numbers. Allowed to sit in the shade. If they played their cuneiform cards right, they could climb a rung or two on the social ladder, assuming the ladder wasn't on fire or blocked by bureaucracy. Then, the workers. Farmers, builders, weavers, brewers, potters, everyone. The 90%. The ones who actually kept things running. Who dug canals in blazing sun and baked bread for temple feasts they weren't allowed to attend. Their names weren't etched in stone. Their lives weren't mythologized. But without them, every city would collapse in 3 days flat. And below, even that at the very bottom, were the enslaved. People taken in war, born into bondage, or crushed by debt. The gears of early empires ran on their backs. In many ancient societies, they weren't even considered fully human. Just a statistic in the palace inventory: 2 oxen, 4 amphorae, 17 slaves. This, friends, was the great sorting hat, civilization's favorite party trick. Unlike earlier human life where roles were fluid and people could drift between tasks, civilized roles stuck. You were born a farmer? Congrats. You'd die a farmer. Unless you married unusually well or saved the city from a rogue hippo, your status was locked in like wet clay drying in the sun. And because this system felt unfair, because it was, The elites needed a narrative, so they invented myths. Not the fun kind with trickster gods and talking crocodiles. These were social myths. You deserve your place. The gods made it so. Don't ask questions. Hierarchies were natural, divine, even scientific, though the word scientific hadn't been invented yet. Your suffering wasn't injustice, it was order. Sound familiar? The stories were everywhere. Epic poems that glorified kings, creation tales that placed elites closest to the divine, law codes that punished the poor more harshly than the rich. Even the architecture joined in. Temples and palaces towered over the mud-brick homes of the masses, physically reminding everyone who was closer to the sky. And yet, life went on. People married, baked bread, sang lullabies. Kids played with toy carts and miniature clay animals. Love bloomed in alleyways. Laughter echoed through courtyards. Despite the weight of the pyramid above them, literal or social humans found light. But make no mistake, inequality had become systemic, and it wasn't just about food or status. It reached into the human psyche. People started measuring their worth in comparison to others. Suddenly, being good wasn't just about surviving, it was about ranking. Who was holier? Who had better sandals? Who owned more goats? Status anxiety was born. Now people worked not just to live, but to prove, to climb, to avoid falling. Life became a ladder with fewer rungs than climbers. The middle classes clung to their positions like frightened cats, terrified of tumbling down into the muck below. And at the top, the elite weren't relaxed. They were paranoid. Power makes people nervous, especially when it's propped up by myth and muscle. So kings built walls, priests invented rituals to purify the air, courts kept spies, armies expanded, not just to conquer, but to control. The result? Empires. Mesopotamia begat Akkad, which begat Babylon. Egypt rose with pharaohs and pyramids. China birthed dynasties. India saw the Indus Valley give way to the Vedic world, each with its own spin on order, power, and this is totally fine, stop asking questions. The more complex the system, the more rigid the classes. Slavery became institutional, gender roles tightened. Women, once active in early farming and trade, were increasingly pushed into the background. Their roles confined, their names erased. The Great Sorting Hat wasn't just sorting wealth, it was sorting voices. But cracks appeared. Rebellions flared. Peasants rioted. Entire cities burned. Empires fell and rose again. Every generation produced someone who said, "Wait a minute, what if this isn't okay?" But the system was resilient. It adjusted, rebranded, offered new myths, new gods, new justifications. Some of those justifications still linger. You hear them in modern boardrooms, politics, schools. Some people are just naturally better. You have to earn your worth. It's not personal, it's the system. These aren't new thoughts. They're ancient scripts, echoing from the ziggurats. But here's the other thing. Humans resist. Even at the height of inequality, people shared food, helped neighbors, hid fugitives, told forbidden stories, painted jokes on pottery, invented new languages in the margins, built underground networks of trust, because we've always known the truth. No matter how many crowns you stack, no matter how many statues you build, you still rely on others. No one eats alone, no one survives alone. And deep down, beneath the weight of the sorting, we remember we were once equals, once kin, once wild things dancing under the stars without ladders or labels. The city walls are tall, yes, but so are we. The thinking ape thinks too much. Somewhere between temple taxes and goat-led empires, Homo sapiens got a dangerous idea. What if we thought about this stuff? Like, really thought about it? Not just, what time do we plant the barley? Or, where did I put my left sandal? But deeper, darker, more confusing thoughts. Like, what is a soul? What is justice? Why do I feel sad in the middle of a good harvest? Why does my neighbour have more goats than me even though I clearly have better hair? Congratulations, we had officially become philosophers. It started as murmurs. Priests and scribes wondering about the shape of the heavens, the nature of truth, the role of the gods. But soon, thinking itself became a profession. Thinkers rose across the ancient world, in India, China, Greece, Persia, Egypt. Some wore robes, others sat under trees. All of them said things like, "You know what your problem is," and then proceeded to ruin dinner with existential dread. Take Greece, a sunny place filled with olives, sandals, and deeply anxious men. Socrates walked around asking so many questions. He was eventually sentenced to death for being annoying. Plato turned his mentor's ideas into dialogues filled with metaphorical caves and symbolic everything. Aristotle tried to categorize literally everything, including eels, emotions, and probably feelings about eels. Meanwhile, over in India, thinkers were wrestling with selfhood, karma, suffering, and reincarnation. The Upanishads whispered that the self is an illusion. The Buddha taught that attachment is suffering, and the best way to deal with reality is to stop craving, well, anything. In China, Confucius was all about social harmony, respect, and very uncomfortable family dinners. Laozi went the other way, ride the flow, do nothing, let the world be weird. One said duty, the other said chill. Both were right, and also incredibly quotable. Even in Mesoamerica and Africa, thought systems evolved cyclical time, ancestor reverence, layered cosmologies, dualities between light and dark. Humans were no longer just surviving. We were interpreting the very nature of survival. And then came science. Not the lab coat kind, yet, but observations, hypotheses, experiments. The sky was no longer just the home of gods. It was a system. Babylonian astronomers tracked the stars. Indian mathematicians toyed with zero. Chinese engineers invented compasses, paper, printing. People began to wonder, maybe lightning isn't Zeus being grumpy, maybe it's something else. This was thrilling and dangerous, because once you start asking questions, the myths get shaky. And if the myths get shaky, the hierarchies do too. So naturally, the powerful got nervous. Some thinkers were praised, others were exiled, jailed, or executed. The message was clear: think all you want, but don't get too clever. Still, the seeds had been planted. Curiosity was no longer a luxury, it was a human compulsion. But all this thinking had side effects. For one, existential dread. Once you realize the stars aren't just pinholes in a sky, tarp, but giant flaming balls of gas that will eventually die, things get weird. Once you understand that your brain is just wet meat trying to explain itself, things get weirder. And once you realize you're standing on a rock spinning through a void, enjoy your insomnia. People started feeling lonely in crowds, small under monuments, conflicted about ambition. What was success? What was good? Were the gods watching, or was it all random? These weren't questions our mammoth-hunting ancestors had to ask. They were too busy not dying. Now we had time to think. Too much time. And so, art changed. Earlier cave painting said, "This is a bison." Classical sculpture said, "This is a body." Medieval iconography said, "This is a soul." Renaissance art whispered, "This is an idea." And modern art screamed, "What even is meaning?" Before painting a toilet and walking out of the gallery, we also invented time. Yes, we always had seasons. But now we had clocks, sand timers, water clocks, sundials, and eventually mechanical ones. Suddenly life wasn't just day and night, it was hours, minutes, seconds. Tick, tick, tick. We had appointments, deadlines, the tyranny of punctuality. Our lives became sliced into measurable chunks, and surprise, we never had enough of it. We invented free time, and immediately panicked about how to use it. So we filled it with books, games, debates, drama. Theatre boomed. Poems were written about love and war and furniture. Libraries emerged, storing human thought in paper vaults. The great ones, Alexandria, Nalanda, Timbuktu, became sanctuaries of mind. And when we had enough thoughts, we started shipping them. Caravans moved ideas across deserts. Sailboats spread philosophies to new continents. Printing presses blasted ideas across towns. And eventually, thanks to traders and conquerors and the occasional friendly monk, our collective brain went global. But for every idea spread, others were lost. Fires burned libraries. Empires collapsed. Languages died. Whole systems of knowledge vanished in war, conquest, or just plain forgetting. The great forgetting was back. But this time, it came with footnotes and drama. And still, we thought, because thinking is what we do. It's our greatest strength and most exhausting hobby. We imagined gods, and then questioned them. We built systems and then rebelled against them. We invented nations and then wrote essays on why nations are fake. We became the species that asks why, even when there's no answer. And this, in a way, is what made us truly human. Not just the art, not just the tools, but the voice in our heads that won't shut up, the one that says, what if I did it differently? What if I was wrong? What does it all mean? We are the ape who thinks, and sometimes the ape who thinks too much, the explosive century. Then came the Big Bang, not the cosmic one, the human one, the one that started in workshops and fields, in coal mines and patent offices, and ended in factories belching smoke, cities wrapped in wires, and eventually teenagers doom-scrolling at 2 a.m. Welcome to the last 300 years, or, more precisely, the last heartbeat of our species. The Industrial Revolution didn't just accelerate history, it duct-taped a jet engine to it and hit the red button. It began with steam, not the soothing kind from tea, but the powerful kind from pistons. Humans had harnessed wind, water, muscle, and fire before, but now they found a way to turn coal into relentless motion. Machines started spinning cloth faster than hands ever could. Trains appeared, screaming through the countryside at a horrifying 30 miles per hour. Ships no longer needed wind. Factories no longer slept. This changed everything. In 1 century, more change than in the previous 1,000. Populations boomed. Cities mushroomed. People flooded from rural farms to urban slums, chasing wages, dreams, or just trying not to starve. Children worked 12-hour shifts beside rattling machines. Chimneys grew taller. Rivers turned black. We traded the rhythm of the sun for the shriek of factory whistles. And at first, it seemed awful. Which, to be fair, it was. But it also brought new wonders. Clean water systems, vaccines, eyeglasses, elevators, encyclopedias. Suddenly, information wasn't passed down orally, it was mass-produced. Ideas, once reserved for priests and scribes, were now printed on cheap paper and sold in corner stalls. Literacy exploded. So did revolutions. Because when people read, they think. And when they think, they organize. The 18th and 19th centuries were a carnival of uprisings, declarations, and guillotine-related decisions. People shouted about rights, reason, and representation. Kings lost their heads. Nations were born. Others fell. The great sorting hat got kicked across the room more than once. Meanwhile, colonialism was busy rowning everyone's weekend. European powers, high on industry and nationalism, decided the world was available. Africa, Asia, the Americas cut, carved, claimed. Lines were drawn with rulers, ignoring rivers, tribes, languages. Entire continents were treated like giant warehouses of spice, rubber, diamonds, and humans. The same tools that built railroads also built empires, and the same machines that printed books also printed propaganda. In short, progress came with plunder. Still, the century didn't slow down. Inventions kept arriving like badly timed fireworks. The telegraph, the telephone, the light bulb, the car, the plane. Electricity crept into homes. Oil gushed from the ground. Plastic was invented, and nature collectively sighed. And then boom again, world wars. Twice. In the span of a single lifetime, Homo sapiens went from writing letters by candlelight to dropping atomic bombs. Trench warfare gave way to nuclear standoffs. Civilians became targets. Technology got bigger, faster, meaner. We invented the means to destroy ourselves completely and then built more of them. After World War II, the pace only increased. TVs glowed in living rooms. civil rights movements surged. The Cold War turned global anxiety into a lifestyle, but also space travel, the moon, satellites, computers the size of rooms, then desks, then pockets. In a blink, we went from hunting mammoths to swiping right on dating apps, powered by distant servers. The internet changed the game completely. It linked billions of brains into one noisy, glitchy hive. You could now access the wisdom of the ages and also cat videos, conspiracy theories, and your ex's vacation photos. Knowledge was no longer a privilege. It was a torrent. Filtering truth from noise became the new literacy. And now? Now we live in the echo. Climate change is here, waving every red flag. Species vanish by the hour. The seas rise. Forests burn. And we clever, anxious, distracted apes try to solve it using the same tools that caused it. We invent more. We innovate harder. We pray to the god of exponential growth and hope we don't run out of runway. We are wealthier, more connected, more informed than ever before, and also lonelier, more divided, more overwhelmed. We measure our value in likes. We mistake busyness for meaning. We invented algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves. And yet, we still fall in love. We still tell stories. We still dance at weddings and cry at funerals. We still stare at the stars and feel small. We still make music out of grief and art out of chaos. The fire is still here, it's just pixelated now. So, what do we do with this explosive century? Some say we're doomed. Others say we're just getting started. Maybe both are true. But if there's one thing history has taught us, it's that Homo sapiens are weirdly resilient. We adapt. We rethink. We survive. Not always gracefully, but creatively. We are the species that invented gods, killed them, then reinvented them as apps. We build cities on floodplains and then develop waterproof shoes. We eat cheese, even though it smells like feet. We write poetry about sadness and then laugh at fart jokes. We are brilliant and baffling, and the ride isn't over yet. Still hairless, still weird. Here we are, roughly 250,000 years since Homo sapiens first blinked under the African sun. We now sit indoors, mostly typing on glass rectangles, microwaving leftovers, and arguing online about pineapple on pizza. The journey from stone tools to space telescopes has been breathtaking, also terrifying, also kind of stupid, which is to say, very human. We are still biologically those same creatures from so long ago, still with the same basic hardware, still with brains wired for hunting, gathering, gossiping, and avoiding snakes. But now we're trying to use those brains to file taxes, read terms and conditions, and explain quantum mechanics on YouTube. And it's not going smoothly. The modern world is fast, unnaturally fast. Our ancestors walked across continents at the pace of a tired toddler. Now we livestream space probes, landing on comets from the comfort of a beanbag. We used to have to guess if the berries were poisonous. Now we Google it. We used to run from predators. Now we run from meetings. And our minds? Oh, they're reeling. Anxiety is a survival feature tuned for lions. But now it pings for emails. Loneliness once meant death by isolation. Now it happens in crowded cities surrounded by people. Our stress systems haven't updated since the Pleistocene, and the software is glitching. Still, we keep trying. We invent mindfulness apps and 48-step skincare routines. We return to ancient wisdom, or at least yoga pants. We go on silent retreats and take cold plunges and eat fermented foods because maybe, just maybe, our ancestors were onto something. We're searching for meaning, for peace, for something that doesn't come in a box with next day shipping. And sometimes we find it in a conversation that cracks your ribs open with laughter, in a hug that lingers, in a sunset that makes you forget how many tabs are open in your brain, in the moment your child reaches for your hand without thinking. Because underneath all our tech, all our noise, we are still those strange, soft, stubborn apes, still trying to belong, still afraid of the dark, still in awe of the stars. We've split atoms, mapped genomes, and taught computers to speak. But we still need bedtime stories, still need rituals, still cry at weddings, still pause when we hear an old song and feel something in our chest we can't explain. We are not finished. There is no finish, only the ongoing weirdness of being human. Maybe we'll colonize Mars. Maybe we'll figure out fusion. Maybe we'll just finally agree to stop putting raisins in potato salad. Whatever comes next, it'll still be us, hairless, hopeful, complicated, and completely ridiculous. So the next time you're scrolling late at night, wondering if anything means anything, remember, you are the result of 1,000,000 campfires, 1,000 migrations, countless whispered names. You are the descendant of people who survived ice ages, saber-toothed cats, bad weather, and worse leadership. People who painted dreams on stone and sang lullabies to the moon. People who got scared, got bored, got in trouble, and kept going anyway. You're part of that story, and it's still being written. Let's slow down now. Close the laptops. Dim the lights. Let the last 10,000 years drift into a gentle hum behind your eyes. The story of Homo sapiens is long, winding, absurd, and beautiful. Full of wrong turns, lucky guesses, and quiet, persistent hope. We've crossed deserts, mapped skies, buried our dead with love. We've told stories in every cave, hut, temple, tower, and now, in tiny pockets of glass we carry in our hands. But behind it all, behind the kingdoms and questions and complicated coffee orders, is the same flicker of wonder that started this whole thing. The spark that said, "What's out there?" That looked at the stars and whispered, "I want to understand." That held a newborn and thought, "You belong to us." That pressed a hand against a cave wall and said, "I was here." You are part of that line. Unbroken, ancient, ongoing. So tonight, let your mind stretch back. Past the skyscrapers, past the stone temples, past the woolly mammoths, past the mud and the fire and the silence. Back to the very first human who looked up at the moon and recognized it. You come from that. And whatever tomorrow brings, another meeting, another moment of laughter, another perfectly average Tuesday, you carry the whole story in your bones. Sleep well, strange ape. You've earned it.